Welcome back, everybody. Here we are again. This time we're on episode 9, and today we're going to talk about a topic that's very interesting. Lots and lots of real-world applications. And understanding this concept will really help you if you're running a business or thinking about why businesses behave the way they do, why they have discounts, for example, for senior citizens, why they offer coupons, why they offer discounts for students as opposed to the non-student population for lots of things, why there are things like ladies' nights, why we have a situation where some students get scholarships for college, and a whole bunch of other applications that I think you'll find rather interesting. And it's all based on a concept called elasticity. Elasticity is a fancy word that just measures responsiveness. So, earlier on in the last few weeks, we've been talking about supply and demand and talking about, for example, the law of demand. Law of demand, if you recall, said that as the price of a good rises, quantity demanded falls, ceteris paribus. But the real question in running a business is not, well, all right, when I raise my price, I lose some sales. The real question is, how many sales do I lose? Because if I raise my price 10% and I lose 20% of customers, that's a problem because my total revenues have fallen. But if I raise my price 10% and I only lose 1% of customers, then my total revenues have increased. So knowing about that sensitivity to price, that responsiveness to price, that elasticity of demand, is going to help me think about my pricing policies in a very helpful way. Elasticity is about lots and lots of applications that we see all around us. For example, why do some individuals get offered scholarships to go to a variety of colleges based on academics or athletic abilities? And the basic answer is elasticity. Students in those situations who have very good skills, very high demanded skills in sports or in academics, for them, if the school doesn't lower its price and offer a scholarship, they've got lots of other places they can go. They've got lots of good substitutes. They're very responsive to price. So if institution X doesn't give them a deal, they'll say, well, somebody else wants me, and they'll give me a better price, and they will go toward that other item. Whereas students that don't have those same skill sets, they're not an extremely gifted athlete or very, very high in the academic world, the story is they have fewer alternatives. And so they're sort of stuck with, in some sense, the price that that institution is charging, and no scholarship is necessary. Why do we give senior citizens discounts and students like yourselves discounts at a lot of places? You show your ID card. Well, the answer is students and senior citizens tend to, on average, be more sensitive to price, more elastic in their demand, more responsive to a price change. Senior citizens will go on Senior Citizen Day when they get a 10% discount because they're sensitive to price with their limited budget. The same thing for students. Or here's one for you to think about. There's lots of quizzical things out there like, and you're going to be doing a second writing assignment a little later in this course called the Econ in My World paper. And one thing you might think about are some of these elasticity applications. But here's a question for you. And that is, why is it the case that if you want to book a flight on an airline right before the plane leaves, you're going to pay significantly more than if you book your ticket way in advance, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month, whatever, in advance? Why is that? And the answer basically from an economist perspective is different elasticities of demand. Those individuals who are booking right before the flight departs, right, so a day or two before, they virtually have no choice. There may have been a family emergency where they had to fly across the country to be with a relative who was sick or ill or something going on. Or there was a business meeting, a business trip that had to happen on the spur of the moment, and all of a sudden, like, they don't have any choice, they have to go. In those situations, those individuals are very insensitive to price, not very responsive to price. They don't have any good alternatives, any good substitutes. On the other hand, people that book, a month or more in advance for their tickets, they're probably likely to be vacationers, people thinking about a getaway, and they've got lots of options. They can say, hey, I'm going to shop around. I'm going to look for all these alternatives, and if you don't give me a good deal, I'll go to somebody else. And along those lines, it makes sense that they're going to get a lower price because they're more sensitive. And if we don't lower the price, we won't get their business. Let me give you one other example just to kind of think about this. And this one's kind of interesting. American Airlines. You got two choices. Somebody wants to go from DC to San Francisco, right? And here's the ticket prices. You got two options. You can go direct, DC to San Francisco. So this is direct with no layovers, no stops. DC to San Francisco. And if you do that, it's going to cost $522 for the ticket. Right? But if you want to fly from DC to San Francisco, but you do a stopover, so you go DC down to Dallas, and then you transfer to a plane to get to San Francisco, do you think this is going to cost more or less? And by the way, this is just applying to the tickets for American Airlines. Okay, it's just a couple of years ago. What do you think? Is it going to cost more or less to go DC to Dallas to Frisco versus DC to Frisco? And most of the time we would say, well, it's going to cost more to take the straight shot because they're going to be able to sock it to you. But in fact, for American, they were charging a price of $733 to go from DC to Dallas to Frisco, right? Does that make sense? It's going to take more time. You would think that they would have less ability, but here's the story. For DC, Dallas is or for American Airlines, excuse me, Dallas, Texas is one of their hubs, right? Their main hub. And so what's the deal? They know that if you're flying to Frisco from DC and you're going to go through Dallas, you almost have to go with American. So there aren't many good substitutes. So if people end up booking that flight, we're going to sock it to them. They don't have a very elastic demand. On the other hand, we've got a situation where if somebody goes from DC straight to Frisco, there's a lot of other flights that can do that. There are other carriers that have, flights from DC straight to San Francisco. There's more substitutes, more alternatives. And so people are more sensitive, have more elastic demand. So you better charge better rate here. You can charge more with the stopover in Dallas because people are less sensitive to price. Okay? So that's just something for us to think about in terms of elasticity. It's all over. What should we do with our prices? How do we understand pricing behavior in the world around us? So I'm going to talk in this episode and then in the next episode about 4 different elasticities. 3 of them relate to demand. 1 of them is an elasticity of supply. There are other elasticities, but we're only going to look at those 4 for this particular class. So the first elasticity that I want to look at is the one we're going to spend the most time on, and that's called the price elasticity of demand. So the price elasticity of demand, sometimes called the own price elasticity of demand, because what I'm looking at here is if we're looking at Leinenkugel's red lager, if the price of Leinie's red changes, how much does the quantity demanded of Leinie's red react? So we're looking only at the price of that good itself. Not if the price of spotted cow changes, how does the demand for Leinie's react? Just if the price of Leinie's red changes, how does the demand for Leinie's red or quantity demanded react? And so we're going to actually calculate this, do a little math here. And we're going to calculate a coefficient called the price elasticity of demand coefficient. I like to call it just PED. And what it is the following. It's the percentage change in the quantity demanded of good X in response to, which means divided by, so this is just a ratio, the percent change in the price of that same good X. So it's the percentage change in the quantity demanded of good X divided by the percentage change in the price of good X. As you look at this, let me ask you, is this a positive number or a negative number? Well, this would be a negative the way it's written here, right? Because the law of demand says if Leinie's red increases in price, the quantity demanded of line is red decreases, ceteris paribus. So this is a negative number. And that's a little bit of a problem because comparing negative numbers is a little tricky, right? Is negative 10 bigger than negative 4? And mathematically, the answer is no, negative 10 is smaller. But conceptually, for our purposes, a 10 to 1 response as opposed to a 4 to 1 response is a bigger degree of responsiveness, more elastic. So I'm actually going to make this a positive number. And I'm going to make it a positive number by taking the absolute value. So some books, leave it as negative. I think it's better to do it with the positives here. And so we're going to take absolute value as we calculate elasticity. Now, what can I see about this? Well, one thing that's interesting to me is to look whether this ratio, this number, is going to be bigger than 1, which would mean that the numerator is bigger than the denominator. Whether it's equal to 1, which would mean that the numerator and the denominator are the same magnitude. Or whether it's less than 1, in which case the quantity demanded change in percent terms would be less than the percentage change in the price. And that would be a number less than 1. So we have terms for that. These are important concepts right underneath the definition. Economists say that demand is inelastic. And the little letters in before something mean not. So something that's inelastic is not elastic. That means that this is less than 1, so the numerator is less than the denominator. So for example, if you're running a business and you increase your price 4% and you lose 2% in terms of quantity demanded, you have a 1 to 2, 1/2 as your elasticity of demand. That says you change your price quite a bit and you don't lose that much in terms of sales. So if it's less than 1, then we say that the demand is not very responsive or that it is inelastic. Okay? If it's equal to 1, as the next item says here, we call it unit elastic. That would say if you raise your price 4%, you lose 4% in terms of the volume of sales. That it's a 1-to-1 ratio. And that's called unit meaning 1, unit elastic demand. Lastly, if it's greater than 1, that tells me that the numerator, the percent change in the quantity demanded, is greater than the percent change in the price. So if you raise your price 4% and you lose 10% of sales volume, then people are really sensitive to that price change. And so we say that that demand is elastic. Okay? So less than 1, inelastic. Equal to 1 is unit elastic. And greater than 1 is elastic demand. Now, that's the basic definition, but what we need to be able to do is actually do a calculation of this number and interpret it and see how we can use that for better decision making. So I have on your table there a demand for pizza, and I actually plotted the demand curve as well. You can see that at $10, quantity demanded is 0. If it falls to 9, quantity demanded is 2. At 8, quantity demanded is 4, all the way down to at $0, people would buy 20 pizzas. Again, that's not relevant, it's not realistic. It's just there to make this thing a nice linear demand curve. So what we want to do with that table is then look at the questions in that graph. That question's on the next page. All right? So you can kind of keep that graph in the back of your head, or you can flip back and forth. And then my first question for you is on top of page 2. It says, what happens when the price of this pizza falls from $9 to $8 per pie? And when that happens, quantity demanded increases from 2 pies to 4 pies. So what's the price elasticity of demand? How sensitive are consumers to price changes in that range? Well, we've actually got to figure out how to calculate percent changes to make that work. So go back to page 1, please, where you wrote this general definition, and we're going to write out a formula for calculating this. When it comes to percent changes, I know you've done these in your math classes many, many times, but all you need to do is take the change, the newest value minus the oldest value as your numerator, and compare it to where you started. But where you started for this application is going to look a little different. And I'm going to talk about something called the midpoint formula here. So here's the idea. My numerator is going to be the newest quantity minus the oldest. So that's the change in quantity. But I need to make it a percent change. So I'm going to compare it to the midpoint of these two values. And to get the midpoint, or the average, I just take Q1 plus Q0 and divide by 2, right? So I'm taking the change and I'm dividing it by the average, or the midpoint of those 2 points. That's going to give me a percent change in quantity demanded. The change relative to the average of the 2 that I have. And then I'm going to do the same thing in the denominator with the price. I'm going to take the change in price, P1 minus P0, and I'm going to divide by the average of those 2 points. P1 plus P0 divided by 2. And again, the absolute value of that whole thing. Okay? We can do it this way. I can do it this way, and I'm sure you can as well. We could also rewrite this, and sometimes it's helpful. Do whatever works best for you. But if I'm going to take this numerator and divide by this denominator, it's the same thing as taking the numerator times the reciprocal of the denominator. And if I do that and recombine some terms or reorder them, and I'm not going to go through every step here, but I'm going to get something like this. Right? So I multiplied times the reciprocal of the denominator, and then I did some flipping around and put the P1 minus P0 on this side, and then I put these 2 here. The 2's cross out when I do the flipping, and so I don't have to worry about them. It turns out that this is actually an important concept for later. This leftmost term here is the slope of the demand curve inverted. So it's 1 over the slope. And we're going to use that because slope and elasticity are related to each other, although they're not exactly the same thing. So that might be confusing you just a bit right now, and that's okay. We're going to practice it so that all of the confusion goes away, and you can see how to use this and why we care. So let's turn back to page 2 and go back to our demand for pizza. And here's our situation. The price of pizza falls from $9 to $8, and the quantity demand increases from 2 to 4. What's the price elasticity of demand? Well, when you do these questions, the best thing is to make sure you label your combinations. So the original price in quantity was $9 and a quantity demanded of 2. And so P0, Q0 is 9, 2. And the new price in quantity, P1, Q1, is equal to $8 and a quantity demanded of 4. Okay? And then we simply have to plug and chug, put it into this equation, whichever way we want to do it, and we'll come up with our answer. So PED is equal to the percentage change in quantity. Well, quantity is 4 now. That's Q1 minus Q0 of 2. All right, so that's the change in quantity, 2 extra pizzas. But we have to divide by the average of those 2, the midpoint. So I've got to take 4 plus 2 and divide it all by 2 to get the average. Okay, so that's my numerator. It's the change divided by the average of those 2 points. And I'm going to do the same thing with price. The new price is 8. So I have to take the new price minus the old. Price went down $1, so yes, that's a -1. That's fine. And then I have to divide by the midpoint, or the average of those 2 price values. So I have to take 9 plus 8 and divide that by 2 to get the average. Okay? And then I need absolute value because I want to compare positives, not negative numbers. Okay? So if I do that, I get 2 over the average of 2 and 4, which is 3. And then I've got a negative 1 on the denominator at the top, for the top part. And 9 plus 8 divided by 2 is 8.5. Right? Okay? 2/3 divided by negative 1 over 8.5 is the same thing as 2/3 times 8.5 over negative 1. Just multiply times the reciprocal. And if I do that, 2 times 8.5 is 17. 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. And I've got absolute values still. So that's my answer. My answer is that PED equals 17/3. Or to maybe write it out a little bit easier, I got 5.66 as my answer. My price elasticity of demand, my PED, is a number, and this time it's 5.66. What do you know about that? Is that elastic, inelastic, or unitelastic? It's elastic. It's a number bigger than 1. In fact, the best way to do this, I would encourage you to do this every single time, is to realize that any elasticity number, just take it and divide it by 1. Because 5.66 is equal to 5.66 divided by 1. You're like, Ron, why'd you do that? That's really silly. It's not silly, because that helps me to think about this conceptual definition. If I know what the idea is, I can interpret it, obviously, in a better way. So what that tells me, and it says on your sheet there, what does this number mean? It says that for a 1% change in the price of good X, so that's the denominator, for each 1%, I want to write it out here, for each 1% change in the price, quantity demanded changes by what? So for each 1% change in the price, for each 1% change in price, quantity demanded changes by, and the answer is 5.66%. So for each 1% change in price, quantity demanded changes by 5.66%. That's the ratio. That's why I put it over 1, so I can think about it in this conceptual terms. 5.66% change in quantity for each 1% change in price. So what if price increased by 2%? Well, for each one, we get 5.66. So for 2% change in price, we get 2 times that, right? Or 11.32 if I did my math correctly. For a 5% increase in price, 5 times 5.66, because this is for each 1%. It goes the other way. If price decreased by 1%, quantity demanded would increase by 5.66. For a 2% decrease, it would increase again by 13.32, etc., etc. That's how to interpret these numbers, and is really, really important if you're running a business, as we will see shortly. And if you have to go back and rewind this, or not rewind, nobody rewinds anymore, push the button to go back and start this and play this part again, and then definitely contact me if you have any questions. I want to do it again. I want to do another application here, which is question number 2 there. And question 2 says, back to the pizza example, what happens if the price starts at $2 and it falls to $1 a pie, when the quantity then increases from 16 to 18? What's the price elasticity of demand? Well, again, you want to identify your points. So we start at P0, Q0, which is $2 a pie. Man, at that price, I'm getting hungry. And a quantity of 16 pies. That's P0, Q0. And then the price falls to 1. So P1 is $1, and quantity 1 is 18 pies demanded at that really, really hyper low price. Then once I've identified that, I simply have to plug it into my formula and create those ratios of percent change in quantity to percent change in price. So let's do that. PED equals the percent change in quantity. Well, the new quantity is 18, and the old one is 16. So I'm going to start with 18 minus 16 and compare it to the average of those two, right? Which is 18 plus 16 divided by 2. So that's my numerator. That's the percent change in the quantity demanded. The change divided by the average of the two. And then I'm going to calculate on the bottom the percent change in price. Well, the new price is 1, and the old price is 2. So new minus old says price went down $1. That's why it's a negative 1. 1 minus 2. 1 minus 2. But I then have to divide by the average of those two prices. So I'm going to take 1 plus 2 and divide by 2 to get the average of those. And then I need to take the absolute value of the whole thing to make this a positive number. So if you go through this, you'll get 18 minus 16, which is 2, over 18 plus 16 divided by 2, which is 17. And then all divided by 1 minus 2, which is negative 1, divided by 1 plus 2 divided by 2, which is 1.5, right? Which is 1.5. And so if you do that, you're going to take the absolute value. You can plug it into your calculator, or you can just say, hey, I can multiply times the reciprocal of this denominator to get an easier way to do this, and that is 1.5 over negative 1. And if you do that, you get 3 over negative 17 absolute value. That's 3/17. When you make it positive with absolute value. Or in decimal form, if you do that, you get 0.18. 0.18. Okay? Much, much smaller than what we had with the first example. Now the elasticity is much less than 1. What are you going to do when you get an elasticity coefficient? Every single time? You're going to divide it by 1, because that's what the definition says, right? It tells us the ratio of the percent change in quantity demanded, the numerator, when there's a given percent change in the price. So the question says, what does this number, this 0.18, mean? And it means what we have right up here. I'll let you write it down again. For each 1%, because that's what we created here as our denominator, each 1% change in price, quantity demanded changes by 0.18%, right? About 1/5 of 1%. In this case, people aren't very sensitive to price. When the price drops from $2 to $1, they don't change their quantity demanded percentage-wise all that much, okay? And so the story is that the demand is relatively inelastic. Each 1% change in price leads to a 0.18% change in quantity demanded. Inelastic demand. Now, you might look at that and say, that's kind of weird, because on that demand curve from page 1, if you look back there, that demand curve is linear. It has a constant slope. And slope, I thought, and elasticity were the same thing, but they're not. They're related to each other. When I rewrote this, you can see that slope is part of this inverse of the slope. But there's this other term. And that means that slope and elasticity are not the same thing. In fact, if you look at that graph, on the bottom of page 2, and you think about what we just calculated, here's what you'll observe. Here's the demand for that pizza. The price intercept was up here at 10, and the quantity intercept was over here at 20, And so halfway between them, what we call the midpoint, of course, would be 10 on that axis and 5 on that axis, which is right here. So this is the midpoint, right? And for the first exercise of calculating PED, we started with the price of 9, where the quantity demanded was 1, and dropped the price to 8, where the quantity demanded increased to 2. And when we calculated PED, we got 5.66, which was greater than 1. Then, when we did the second example, and we had the price start at $2, where the quantity demanded was 16, and had the price drop to $1, and the quantity demanded was 18, we calculated the PED here in this midpoint, and we got equal to 0.18, which is clearly less than 1. What we see, and what you want to put on your sheet, is that if we are at any price quantity combination above the midpoint, we are going to come up with an elasticity coefficient that's greater than 1. That is, that at those high prices, demand is elastic. When we have any combination that's below the midpoint, like the example we did the second one, you're going to come up with a PED, an elasticity that's less than 1. Or equivalently, demand at those low prices is very inelastic. And if you actually calculated the elasticity right at the midpoint, which means that for really teeny tiny little changes, for those of you who've had calculus, you know what I mean. This is the derivative evaluated at a point. The story is that if you haven't, don't worry, you don't need calculus for this class. But right at the midpoint, the coefficient equals 1, which is to say that right at the midpoint, demand is unit elastic. So along a linear demand curve, elasticity is not constant. Slope is constant, but elasticity and slope are not identical. We're going to talk more about that in the next application. Why is this important? It's going to be important later in this class when we talk about running a business and maximizing your profits. Because I'm going to prove to you later in the class that a profit maximizing firm will always operate in the elastic portion of their demand curve. They'll never operate down here. And I'll prove that to you a few weeks from now later in the course. For right now, just note that slope and elasticity are not the same. That at high prices, elasticity tends to be very elastic. And at low prices, it tends to be very inelastic, all else equal. Okay? All right. So let's actually then turn to the next page. Catch your breath for a second. You hear about the guy who lost his entire left side? Yeah, he's all right now. Well, you don't like that joke? All right. How about this one? How many surrealists does it take to change a light bulb? Pizza. I don't like that one either. Anyway, we're going to continue here. I've got some econ jokes. I'll share some good stuff with you along the way here, and I got a lot of other ones too. But let's go to the top of the next page and talk about how elasticity and slope relate to each other. This is actually going to be really useful when we draw these graphs and do a bunch of applications. So let me recreate the 4 graphs you already have on your sheet side by side, because this will be a very useful and very practical application. So we've got 4 graphs side by side. The reason is I want to compare things, right? I want to look at a situation where in the first graph, I want you to draw a demand curve that is horizontal at a price of P0. So where you see P0 there already on your sheet, draw a solid demand curve that is perfectly flat, perfectly horizontal. And let me tell you that at P0, the quantity demanded, right, let's say it's this Q0. What happens to this business that faces a demand curve like this if they decide to raise their price? What's going to happen to the demand for their product? If you said there isn't going to be any, you are absolutely positively correct. Any little deviation from P0 is going to lead to demand disappearing. And obviously that kind of demand is completely responsive to price, what economists call perfectly elastic, perfectly sensitive to price. If you were to calculate a PED coefficient, you'd get infinity, right? Completely sensitive to price, perfectly elastic demand. And you might be looking at that and saying, Ron, help me out with this, right? Are there any examples of such a thing in the real world? Well, yes, there are. And in fact, we're going to use one example rather extensively in coming weeks. We're going to talk about a firm that's operating in an industry that is so ultra competitive that we call it perfect competition. And what I want you to think about here would be something like wheat farming 100 years ago. Not today with all the agribusiness, mega conglomerate farms and all of that, but 100 years ago, 75 years ago, wheat farming, for example. There were lots and lots and lots of wheat farmers, right? And they were all producing the same thing. And so let's talk about one individual wheat farmer. Let's call him Bob, wheat farmer Bob. Wheat farmer Bob. And Bob is a small operation, right? He's one of many, 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 many firms producing exactly the same thing. Suppose in the market for wheat, the going price is $2 a bushel. What's Bob going to charge to sell his wheat? $2 a bushel. He can sell as much wheat as he can produce at $2. What if Bob says, heck no, right? I'm Bob. Buy from Bob. Right? I'm going to charge $2.50 a bushel, P1. What's everybody going to say? Nice to see you, Bob, right? I'm going down to Farmer Sally down the lane and going to buy the wheat from her. You ain't got nothing special, Bob, right? I'm going to go buy it from somebody else who's cheaper and producing exactly the same product. If Bob raises his price a penny or even less over P0, $2 a bushel, he loses all of his sales. If he charges a price less than that, he's a fool. Because if he charges a price less than $2 a bushel, he's going to sell it all, but he could have sold it all at $2. He's a drop in the bucket in this market. He has a perfectly elastic, completely price-sensitive demand curve. That's going to have a huge effect on how he does business, right? Now let's compare that situation of perfectly elastic demand to what you see in the second graph. So I have the same price tracked over here. So here's P0 again, and Q0. What if the demand curve in this case looks like this, downward sloping, but really flat? Right? I missed. So we've got a downward sloping demand curve, really flat. I want you to draw that. So where D0 and P0 are, you'll see where they intersect. I want you to draw a really flat demand curve that touches there. Okay. What happens here if the price increases just a little bit to P1? The story is that quantity demanded decreases a lot. So for a little increase in price, that says a little, there's a big decrease or a lot of a decrease in the quantity demanded. In this case, demand is very sensitive to price. You raise your price a little, you lose a lot of sales, right? You don't lose all sales like Bob, but you lose a lot. So we call this type of demand relatively, not perfectly, but relatively elastic. People are very sensitive to price, but you don't lose everything. We're going to talk about a market structure later called monopolistic competition. And we might think in that example about a person named Luigi who happens to own a restaurant, a Mexican restaurant, right? Actually, let's talk about a pizza joint, a Mexican. How many Mexican Luigis do we know? Anyway, an Italian restaurant, right? A pizza joint, Luigi's Pizza Joint. And the story is that if Luigi is charging, P0 per pie for his pizza, and he raises his price 10%, what's going to happen? Well, he's probably not going to lose everybody. But in a market that's big, like a city like Madison or Milwaukee or Chicago or whatever, where there are lots and lots and lots of other pizza restaurants and other restaurants that are choices for consumers, if Luigi jacks his price up, a lot of people are going to say, I can get the same or very similar, at least, product somewhere else, and they're going to stop patronizing or going to Luigi's for business, for dinner. Luigi's not going to lose all of his sales, right? Unlike Bob, because Luigi has something special. He's got, a particular location. He has some patrons that are loyal to him because, hey, they got engaged at that restaurant, or their first date was at that restaurant, or they love the view of the lake, or they love the secret sauce that's used on the spaghetti or whatever. But he's going to lose a lot of sales. Not all sales, but some. In fact, quite a bit of sales. So his demand is relatively elastic. Let's compare that with the third chart, where again, we're going to track over the same price, P0, and we're going to look at a situation where demand is very, very steep. Not perfectly steep, not vertical, but very, very steep. So I want you to draw that steep demand curve so that it hits where P0 and Q0 intersect. You can see that on your sheet there. What happens here if the price increases a little bit? I should be drawing this in blue. What happens here when the price goes up to P1, right, is that there's very little responsiveness, very little change in the quantity demanded. So here's a little increase in price, and you get a very little decrease in quantity demanded. Not much response at all. And you guessed it, economists, logical creatures that we are, call this kind of demand relatively inelastic, right? Relatively inelastic, not sensitive to price. So here, you might be thinking about a business that has a lot of monopoly power. Maybe we'll call this person Ollie, the oligopolist, or Mary, the monopolist. We'll use those terms later in more specific ways. But Ollie or Mary, and they happen to be running a business with little competition. So maybe this is your electric utility company, right? The electric company. What happens if the electric utility company raises their rates, let's say 10%? Well, some people will cut back. Some people will stop using a little bit of extra electricity, but we're not likely to see a 10% decrease in the quantity demanded, something less than that, right? So not very sensitive to price. There aren't many good substitutes for electricity, right? You can obviously use wood and you can do other kinds of things, but there are not a lot of good substitutes that are widely accepted by the overall population. And so we have not much sensitivity to price, relatively inelastic. And then the last one here, again, if you track over P0, I want you to draw a demand curve that is vertical at Q0. Okay? And what that says is at a price of P0, quantity demanded is Q0. If the price increases to P1, what happens to quantity demanded? I forgot I'm supposed to use blue. Price goes up to P1, quantity demanded does not change at all. People are not sensitive to the price one iota. And so you guessed it, this type of demand is called perfectly inelastic. Perfectly inelastic, not responsive to price whatsoever. And you might think about, well, what's a good example here? A good example here might be something like going to see, a football game at Camp Randall Stadium in Madison for the Badgers. Go Bucky, right? My alma mater for my master's and PhD. Go Bucky. The thing is that, Camp Randall Stadium only has, X number of thousands of seats. I can't remember what that number is. It keeps changing all the time. But the story is, let's say they've got 80,000 seats, right? No matter what the price is, they've only got 80,000 seats. And so their ability to, that's not right. That's a supply graph. Forget that one. Please erase that. My brain just turned off for a second. And I do apologize. We don't want to use Camp Randall here. We want to talk about, that's a perfectly inelastic supply. So I jumped ahead there. But when we think about the demand here, this is one where consumers aren't sensitive to price. So my bad. This might be if you're a diabetic and you have to have insulin in order to stay alive. And if you need insulin or some other drug, if you're in a different situation or whatever, then the story is that no matter what the price is, the argument is that you're going to have to find a way to be able to get that drug. Some people won't be able to, and at that point the demand curve becomes a little bit flatter. But in the relevant price range, no sensitivity whatsoever to demand. So while elasticity and slope are not identical, because along each of these demand curves, above the midpoint is where we have greater than 1, below we have less than 1, and at the midpoint we have equal to 1. This curve is more elastic than this one, which is more elastic than this one, right? And this one is the most elastic of them all. And so it is a relative concept as well as an absolute concept, elasticity. Now, what determines elasticity? Why is the demand for some products really sensitive to price and the demand for other products not very sensitive at all? And we've actually hinted at a few of those ideas with these examples, but I want to make that more formal, and that's on your notes there next. So there are 3 factors that determine how sensitive demand or quantity demand it is to a change in price, how elastic the demand is. The first is the number and closeness of substitutes. So, and the rule is the more and the closer the substitutes for a given good or service, the more elastic the demand for that good or service. So, you know, we talked about wheat farmer Bob. If Bob raises his price, he's going to lose all of his demand. And the reason is because there are a ton of really, really close, in fact, perfect substitutes for Bob's wheat, right? Luigi has a lot of substitutes. So he's going to face a really elastic demand, but not perfectly so. Ollie and Mary don't have many substitutes for their good or service. And so when they raise their price, they're not going to lose much. There aren't many places people can go. And so the more and the closer the substitutes, the more sensitive demand is to price changes, the more elastic is demand. So let me just give you an example here to think about it, right? Let's talk about the demand for food and the demand for beer and the demand for Leinenkugel's Red Lager beer and the demand for Leinie's Red beer at Joe's Saloon in Madison. Okay? If we think about those 4 items, which one is the most elastic in demand? Food, a general category, something we need for life. Beer, in general. Leinie's Red beer, a specific kind of beer. Or Leinie's Red beer at Joe's Saloon, a specific beer at a specific location. The one that has the most substitutes is a specific beer at a specific location. So the demand for Leinie's Red at Joe's is pretty elastic. The demand for Leinie's Red is a little bit more inelastic because there's still a lot of substitutes, Spotted Cow and Pete's Wicked Ale and all those hard cider things and whatever. There's a lot of stuff out there, but the story, Busch Light or whatever, but the story is that there aren't as many substitutes as at Joe's Saloon. For beer in general, it's a little bit steeper yet. There are fewer substitutes for beer than there are for a specific kind of beer and at a specific place. And for food, of course, the demand is much more inelastic, that we have to have food for survival, and so there aren't many good substitutes. Okay? So that's the first determinant of elasticity. Think about how many substitutes are there. Why do, again, really gifted athletes and really gifted scholars get scholarships to go to college? Because those individuals have a lot more substitutes. So if going to UW-Madison, they raise their tuition a lot, those students might say, I can go someplace else. Lots of people want me. They'll throw money at me. I can get a better deal somewhere else. And so those individuals get a lower price. Okay? The second determinant is the percent of one's budget spent on an item. I mean, there are some things we spend a lot of money on in terms of our budget, and there are some things that we don't spend very much on. And so the rule is, and this is a little bit ceteris paribus, the rule is the bigger the percent of your budget spent on an item, the more sensitive, the more elastic is the demand for that item. So the more you spend on an item as a percent of your budget, the more sensitive the demand is for that item. And that's not always 100% true because it relates to substitutes. But if you think about it, we could look at two different goods here. We could look at the market for going to college, right? And we could look at the market for table salt. How big is your tuition bill as a percent of your budget? It's reasonably big percent, right? MATC does our best to keep those prices relatively affordable, but it's a bigger percent for sure than table salt. Right? Table salt as a percent of your budget is teeny tiny. So if the price of college, the tuition goes up 10%, and the price of table salt, which sells for, 89 cents, goes up 10%, right? Which one is going to have a bigger percentage change in the quantity demand? Which one's going to be more sensitive to that 10% increase in price? Yeah, the demand for going to college, right, is going to be more elastic than is the demand for table salt, which are like, it's such a tiny blip in my budget. Who cares? It's not going to really affect my overall buying power. And, that is partly due to the fact that elasticity is a ratio of percent changes, not absolute amounts. And so, 10% on 89 cents is a lesser amount than 10% on, $500 or $600 for a 3-credit course. And so that's why it's a different one. So the bigger the percent of your budget spent on an item, typically the more elastic the demand. And there's one more determinant here, and that is time. So we've got the number of substitutes and closeness, the percent of your budget on an item, and then time is the third. And the rule is over time, demand becomes more elastic. Let's think about gasoline, just as an example for this one. And here's the story. Here's the price per gallon and the number of gallons. And suppose gas is out there at $3 a gallon, right? At that particular price right now, let's suppose that a given gas station sells 1,200 gallons a day, right? What happens if the price skyrockets? It goes up by a third overnight to $4 a gallon, right? What's going to happen to the quantity demanded in the short term? And if you said not much, you're right. Because in the short term, we're kind of stuck. So they might reduce their quantity demanded by the whole market down to 1,000. But the story is that it's not that big of an effect. So in the short run, demand is very insensitive. There aren't many good substitutes in the short run for me using gas in my car to get to work and to get to the stores and do the things I need to do. I can do some reductions. I can combine trips. I can stay at home instead of eating out, one night a week. I can, decide to, whatever. But I'm really kind of stuck. I've got the same vehicle that uses X amount of gas, gets X number of miles per gallon. I'm working at the same place. I'm living at the same place. I don't have a carpool set up, those kinds of things. So I'm kind of stuck. But what happens over time? What happens if gas stays at $4 a gallon for a long time? Then people start to make changes, right? They say, ooh, maybe I could walk to work a couple of days a week or bike to work. Maybe I could contact and see if there is a carpool that stops off at my place or in the direction of where I'm going. Ultimately, maybe I move, closer to where I work so I don't have to drive as much. Maybe I, change my ways in other ways. So what that means is that in the long run, demand looks more like this, right? If at $3, $1,200 was how much was bought originally, and price stays at $4, then over time there's going to be a much bigger decrease in the quantity demanded. Over time, demand tends to become more sensitive to price, tends to be more elastic. If you want to look at some actual elasticity coefficients, that's at the bottom here. This is replicated from your book, but there's a few here that are kind of interesting. So for example, airline travel. We talked about this earlier in the introduction to this episode, that people who book, right before the flight is ready to go are less sensitive to price and they pay a higher one, and those who book way ahead have a more sensitive demand. Well, look at air travel. In the short run, the elasticity coefficient, PED, is just 0.1. Very inelastic, right? Not sensitive to price hardly at all. But in the long run, it's 2.4. So that means that if the airlines lower their prices, right, 10% or 1%, excuse me, then they get a 2.4% increase in bookings. If they lowered their price 10%, they get a 24% increase in business or bookings. And so very, very sensitive to price in the long run when people are planning ahead. On the other hand, look at gasoline, and it's very similar to what we just said. In the short run, it's 0.3. In the long run, it's 0.9. Still inelastic, but getting more elastic as time goes by. Just another one to look at here might be automobiles at the bottom, the next to the bottom one, the next to last, the penultimate one. Automobiles versus Chevrolets. For automobiles in general, pretty elastic demand, right? Pretty price sensitive because, they are a big part of our budget. And so when the price changes 10%, that's a big hit to a lot of people who might not be able to afford those vehicles. But you see that for a particular type of car, a Chevrolet, that number is significantly higher because there are even more substitutes for a Chevrolet than there are for cars in general. So the numbers bear out the theory, and it explains a lot of how the world behaves, why businesses do what they do. In fact, that's where I want to go next. And it'll be the last topic for this episode. And that is to talk about how PED is related to revenues. This is just an application of what we've already been doing. But I want you to think about a couple of additional situations. What's the relationship between PED, price elasticity of demand, and total revenue for a business? Well, total revenue for a business is just equal to how many units of your product you sell times the price sold per unit. And price elasticity comes in because if the price changes up or down a certain percent, it tells us how much quantity demanded reacts. A lot or a little is going to tell us whether we're going to have more revenue or less when we raise or lower our price. So the basic principles are in that gray shaded box. And I want you to think about it in a basic sense before we do applications. But if demand is inelastic, people aren't sensitive to price. The moral of the story from the business perspective is sock it to them. People aren't sensitive to price. Make them pay, right? And so if you raise your price, you're not going to lose many people if demand is inelastic. And the fact that you lost a few people is more than made up from in the higher price per unit. On the other hand, if the demand that you face is elastic, very, very sensitive to price, right? Then the story is give people a break, right? Help them out, lower the price, and you're going to make those people want to buy from you. They're very, very sensitive to price. So if it's inelastic, sock it to them. If people are sensitive or elastic, give them a break, right? And you will tend to do better. If people are elastic and you lower your price 2%, you're like, oh my gosh, right, I'm lowering my price. But you're going to more than make up for it in volume of sales if it's elastic. So I've just got 4 applications at the bottom, and then that will be the end of this episode. The first one says, suppose Madison College wants to bring in more revenue. We're in a tight budget situation, right? And we want to bring in more revenue from our sporting events. Should we raise our price or lower our ticket price to those sporting events to increase our revenue stream? And the answer is, yeah, it depends, right? Raise your price. Madison College should raise the prices to go see the basketball games and the volleyball games and the baseball games or whatever if the demand that we face is inelastic, socket to them. So the first blank is inelastic. On the other hand, we should lower our ticket prices if we know that people are sensitive to price. Give them a break, and more of them will come. So if demand is elastic, then we should lower our price, and that would be the best option. How do you come up with this? How do you know how sensitive it is? The answer is you do statistics, you do estimation, you hire consultants to look at that to see how sensitive people are to prices for your particular product. Without that information, you can make a pretty stupid decision. So getting a sense, at least a pretty accurate estimate of elasticity, really important in terms of the revenue side of your business. Now, it's not just about revenue, it's about profits. So we got to think about costs too. And we'll do that in the coming weeks. But for right now, we're just talking about revenue. How about the second question here? Madison Metro buses increased their bus fares. And when they did that, they saw their total revenues decline. So they raised their fares, thinking they wanted to bring more money in, and the revenue actually fell. This happened not that long ago. What does that tell you about the elasticity of demand that Metro faces for their ridership? Yeah, it tells you people are sensitive to price, that the demand is elastic if you're filling in the blank there. They raised their price, and when they did that, a bigger percent of people stopped using the service even though they thought they were going to bring in more because of a higher ticket price. And so it actually backfired on them. They didn't realize that people were sensitive, that they were going to ride buses or not ride buses, ride their bikes or carpool with friends or drive their own car instead when they raise their prices too much. How about question number 3? This is important too in understanding our world. If you're the government and you're trying to raise revenues for the government to provide for, school funding and the military and road construction and all the things that government provides, the question is, what sort of activities are you going to tax? What sort of activities are you going to slap that additional tax on in order to increase your revenues? Well, you're going to put those on activities that have, filling in the blank, inelastic demand, right? Where people aren't very sensitive to price. Because you'll lose some sales, but not that much when that tax is slapped on, and that'll mean more revenues. So examples would be things like alcohol, right? People are kind of addicted. Tobacco, people are kind of addicted. And so the story is those types of activities and some others, sometimes they're called the sin taxes, an old term, but the idea of things that people aren't very sensitive to in price, hit the tax there, and you'll gain a lot of revenues. So that's an important story too, right? And then the last one here is one that you might find interesting. Economists talk about this issue and do a lot of other individuals. Should we legalize the illegal drugs in America? Should we take those illegal drugs like heroin and marijuana and whatever else and legalize? And I want you to know, I want everybody to hear this really clear. This is an incredibly complicated issue, and there are lots of pros and cons and lots of aspects to this equation. So I am not coming up with a definitive answer here, but I want us to think about the basic idea, which is to say, should we legalize? Because here's the story. We all know this, of course. But what does the demand curve look like for addictive drugs, narcotics? And if you said it's really inelastic, it's very, very steep, you're right. That demand for those drugs is very, very insensitive to price. People are hooked. And so let's suppose that we're just going to generalize the market for these drugs. Let's suppose that at a point in time, here's the supply of drugs and here's the demand. Okay? And at that price and quantity, that's the total revenue, price times quantity, this area, that goes to the drug dealers. Price times quantity. Here's the price, here's the quantity. The area of that rectangle would be the total revenue to the dealers. We're going to call it total revenue 0. So what America has been trying to do is restrict supply, and they haven't been very effective at that overall. But the war on drugs, quote unquote, the goal was to get some of the supply off the streets. And let's suppose hypothetically that they've been at least marginally successful at that, which is not necessarily true. But if that happens, what do we see here? What we see here is that the price went up a lot, right? But the quantity demanded only went down a little bit because, again, demand is inelastic. What's the total revenue for the drug dealers? Well, the total revenue for the drug dealers is now this higher price, times this only slightly lesser quantity. So it's the area of this much bigger rectangle, right? Total revenue for the dealers is total revenue 1. And the story is that the war on drugs, the way it's been run, largely incentivizes more dealing and more activities to go out there and try to take advantage and make money on that. So it does beg the question of should we legalize and do things like we do with other legal drugs like alcohol and tobacco, where we legalize them, we do some control in terms of making sure that there's appropriate quality control on those goods, and then we tax them and use the money from tax revenues to try to educate people about the problems of using. So you're like, oh, that's not going to affect me very much. I'm a user. You're just taking money out of my pocket. But if that is the case, if you're, you drink alcohol, or you smoke tobacco, or you use illegal drugs, that money is then hopefully being used to educate young people who are more price sensitive, who have a bigger elasticity of demand to the dangers and the foibles of using those particular products. Again, this is only one piece of the story here when it comes to thinking about drug legalization, but it's an important little story to tell. One last thing that I forgot to mention earlier, and I do want to do it now, is on the quick and the dirty, when you're thinking about drawing a demand curve and whether it's elastic or inelastic, I'll give you a hint, and that is that elastic demand looks like the prongs of the letter E, a capital E, while inelastic demand, right, looks like the capital I. So we've got inelastic demand as a vertical, like the letter I, and elastic demand as the prongs of the capital E, and that's a helpful little device for some students that I intended to mention earlier. I must be getting old. So that's the end of episode number 9. In the next episode, we'll talk about 3 other elasticities, each of them more quickly than this one, and that will be the end of the video lectures for this week. I'll see you soon. Thanks.